afternoon. It's Wednesday afternoon. We'll have another apologetics lesson. We're working on some things with Right Now Media right now, trying to get some kinks worked out. So if you get an email from them, just don't try to log on right now. We'll let you know when we go live with it and when you're able to launch it. Even if the email says it, then don't do it right now. We'll let you know that. We're just trying to work out a couple of kinks we didn't expect because they did change a couple things about it, but we'll have it worked out by tomorrow evening. Should have anyway. So today we're just going to look at this lesson on apologetics this afternoon and talk about the kind of evidence that we have for certain things. We'll start with the first thing, and that's the evidence for the existence of God. So we're going to talk about 5 evidential arguments about evidence. That's kind of redundant there. Evidential arguments. And I think that even though we don't use evidence as the final say in anything in the gospel, we certainly can use evidence. So it's a good to understand these couple of things that I talked about yesterday. To begin with, evidence will never be adequate to bring somebody to salvation, nor is it intended to. That is God's Spirit working within the gospel and someone's response to the actual gospel, not to evidence, okay? Second, we should be honest about the evidence that we see, and we should also be honest about the evidence and lack of evidence on both sides of the issues that we'll talk about. So let's start with the first evidence, and that's the existence of God. So I did post 2 links, like I said yesterday, and the first was Dr. Mohler compelling address about the existence and reality of a living God. It was actually the first of a series of lectures he gave. But I did like the video for this purpose, and I do think it kind of helped establish a few things if you watched it. I realized that, like I said yesterday, these aren't Bible studies. These aren't systematic theology lessons. These are lectures, and there's some philosophy in it. So again, we're not afraid of 4-syllable words and stuff like that, okay? And the reason is because we need to mature in our thinking. And so some things I'm doing is exposing us to some a little bit deeper level type of thinking, philosophy, apologetics, and that all equates to our evangelism, okay? But as I posted the video, I do think it lays out some really important foundational things as far as evidence goes. So we look at the first type of evidence in the existence of God. And so what if someone were to come up to us and just say, okay, Christians, you say there's evidence for the existence of God. Show it to me. Where is it? And so, what would our answer be? And that's a fair question for somebody that doesn't believe to ask. And it's a fair assessment to say we should probably be prepared to have some kind of answer from that. I said this yesterday. If we just say, oh, we just take everything by faith, we just sound like irrational people who just cling to a particular belief that we like the most. And to be honest with you, there's a lot of people out there that probably consider themselves Christians, and that may be a little bit of an apt description of them. I know, because I've met some of them, and some of these arguments or some of these discussions are things that they don't even like to have because it challenges too much of a very simplistic type belief. That and a simplistic type belief, an unchallenged belief, a well-guarded belief is probably a belief that doesn't run very deep, okay? And so we don't need to be scared of these types of conversations, and so we need to prepare for these types of conversations. Dr. Mohler in the video describes 3 broad schools of apologetic method, okay? 3 broad schools. First one is evidentialism. This is a bit of what we're doing in this and some of the following lessons is a little bit of evidentialism. Evidentialists believe that we use evidence in the defense of the gospel of the Christian faith or in evangelism to point toward rational ideas that cause one to consider the truth, okay? And we do that sometimes. Evidence is never sufficient, as we have said already, but is there compelling reason not to use evidence when we have it. Um, do we see this approach of evidentialism in the scriptures? And yes, we do. First of all, Paul uses it to make his case in Romans chapter 1 when he says, "For what can be known about God is plain, because God has shown it to them. His invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world and the things that have been made, so they are without excuse." And so what he does there is he actually uses the evidence of creation in his presentation of the gospel. And remember, he's going to be talking about the gospel. The previous verse is talking about the gospel. And so everything he's going to say builds a case for the gospel that he believes in Romans. So because of that, in understanding the gospel itself, Paul actually uses evidentialism as he points to creation as evidence for a creator. Paul also uses evidence again in 1 Corinthians 15. And here, of course, he's speaking of Jesus' resurrection. And he said, "I delivered to you as of first importance what I also received, that Christ died for our sins in accordance with the scriptures, that he was buried and raised on the third day in accordance with the scriptures." Now, that was enough, because that's essentially laying out some of the foundational issues with the gospel, right? But he goes on, he intentionally goes on and says, "And that he appeared to Cephas," that is Peter, "then to the 12. And he appeared to more than 500 brothers at one time, most of whom are still alive, though some have fallen asleep. Then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles. Last of all, of course, he says he appeared to me, the least of the apostles." So he not only uses evidentialism here, he actually uses it extensively and goes as far as he knows how to go with it. And so he talks about all the number of people that have seen Jesus was raised. And he says some of whom are still alive, or many of whom are still alive. And in order, you can go check the evidence, go see what they have to say. Then Paul himself uses evidentialism very clearly here. And those are just a couple examples. So that's one school that Dr. Mohler talks about in apologetics, is evidentialism. The next one is presuppositionalism. And that's actually kind of the opposite of evidentialism, because it's this idea. There's an understanding that somebody's presuppositions of unbelief cause them to basically shut out every argument, or not be able to understand any argument you make for the gospel. Okay, so the presupposition, if somebody says, "I don't believe there's a God," well, I'm going to tell you about God. They said, "Well, I don't believe there's a God, though, so you can't do that," right? So there's a presuppositionalist idea that we understand that people have a very different view. And Paul, again, the same guy who uses evidentialism, actually also purports a significant amount of presuppositionalism. He says the cross of Christ is foolishness to those who do not believe, but to those who are saved, or do believe, there, it's the power to salvation. So he actually says they can't understand the cross. Okay, so he's using both evidential and presuppositional approaches to his evangelism, and maybe we should learn from Paul and use that combination of them. And when you combine them, that makes the third school, which Dr. Mohler admits to thinking can be useful at times, and that is classical apologetics, which basically is a way of defending the faith by presenting the gospel, understanding that nobody's going to be able to believe it without the power of the Holy Spirit working through it, and at the same time understanding that it's okay to use evidence because, for one thing, we have it, and for another thing, we have biblical examples of it. So we can use all of that together to create for ourselves a good, robust type of apologetic method. So we should present the gospel and do so with evidence when it's plausible. Proverbs 18:17 says, "The one who states his case first seems right, until the other one comes and cross-examines him." I love that verse. And in apologetics, that's the magic key right there. Okay, we hear all these. We hear all these skeptics. We hear all the the arguments from the other side. But are they able to stand up once somebody comes and actually cross examines it? That's a good encouragement for us to know that, wait a minute here, I believe this is truth. I'm staking my life and eternity on this. Therefore, I shouldn't be afraid to use my convictions in order to cross-examine what they think is evidence by producing what I believe is evidence. And this kind of what we're doing with some of these lessons. So Dr. Muller pointed out a very foundational truth. It's kind of a comical truth to this idea: is there a God? It's a foundational question to every single worldview, no matter what they say. Every worldview will have to answer the question and seeks to answer it, and will begin in some kind of way there. He even says this and makes this point, which has been made many times over the last, but especially a couple hundred years, is that anybody who says, I'm an atheist, they're labeling themselves first, foremost, and fundamentally by answering that question of whether there's a God first. And it's ironic that they would say there's no God, and here I am. Who are you? I'm not a believer in God. And so there's a lot of irony to that title. So he points out an article from 2017. It was published in London and the Religion News Service, and he tells, and that article says that Britons now reject creationism overwhelmingly. But he goes on and says, this is a quote from the article, but some find evolutionary theory lacking too. Now, isn't that interesting? So basically, you have the entire European continent, for the most part, at this point, rejecting any kind of creationism, but at the same time, actually kind of finds evolutionary theory untenable or not. Even if they would say they believe it in their biology class to get through college, even though they think that lack of belief in this theory is irrational, they find it completely useless to answer life's bigger questions. And so I do think that's very telling. And he goes on and says less than 10% of people in Great Britain, including those with religious beliefs, now accept the biblical account of creation. Even so, 19% of religious people and 29% of those same religious people in Canada found it somewhat difficult or very difficult to accept any evolutionary science as truth beyond the classroom. And he says significant numbers of British people without religious beliefs, even atheists, do not find the evolution that evolution provides a satisfactory explanation for the development of human consciousness and the origins of what can be called spiritual aspects of human nature. That's 2017. That is a British publication reporting that. So what we really see here and what we have here just is a proof of that atheism nor evolutionary science can sustain any kind of morality, can give reasons for morality, can profess that there can be such a thing as morality or ethics or the greater good, and therefore in human experience it just doesn't seem to work out. Even though these same folks may very well make moral decisions, some of them make good moral decisions at times, they still have a conscience they appeal to, and they understand and know that. They know that they have a conscience from which they're drawing what is right or wrong, or some kind of understanding morality. And what person who's ever lived would say there's absolutely no wrestling about the right or wrong within them at no time? That's just silly. It is part of our human existence to wrestle with morality. The thing that evolutionary theory, and you can look this up, go find this, research this. It has no answer for human consciousness. It has no answer for human emotions other than, it has no answer for human consciousness at all. And human emotions or ideas of morality, evolutionary theorists would say, are only for the point of being able to reproduce. So in other words, we just make the best decisions in order to keep reproducing. And that, in reality, we all know that just doesn't work out. It just doesn't work out at all, and it's never worked. And human experience is very different than that. So what the world is asking people to believe is, and let's face it, and I don't have any way to have a figure on this, but I'm going to guess it's got to be upwards of 95% of humans that live on this earth cannot give you a robust, informed explanation of evolutionary theory. So basically, what you have is a world that is being told you must believe this or it's irrational, even though you don't believe it, and even though your experience and fundamental convictions about what's right or wrong and all the rest are telling you something different than that. That is extremely large. That can't be ignored. You can't just sweep that under the rug. It's just not possible to do that. And so I think that's a big, big evidence. And so human consciousness and human morality and human ethics and human emotions, those are very, very big reasons, big evidences, I believe, for the existence of God. So that is one. Without a moral God creating humans in his image and likeness, there's no scientific explanation that scientists have to tell us why people have a consciousness or why people have morality or any other reason. And so Dr. Muller points out about the article he referenced, human creatures know better than this. So a second evidence for God, for the existence of God, is creation itself. Again, Romans 1, Paul makes this statement directly. And actually, long before Paul existed, long before Romans 1 is inspired by the Spirit of God to be written, then we have this as the first recorded pieces of Scripture, in the beginning, God. And so we have in the beginning, God. And so actually, I believe it's the second full word in the Hebrew is God. So we have a presupposition in the Scriptures that God existed. So so we're not even told about creation, about ourselves, about anything until we're told about God. And it doesn't explain it. It doesn't say that here's all the options from where God may have come from. There's a presupposition built into the Scriptures that God actually pre-existed everything else and was indeed this creator. So we don't have an explanation of a creator. And this points to the fact that there's a presumed belief in a creator. It's foundational, even before we get to creation, to know this. In fact, there's an assumption made that something did not come from nothing in an independent fashion. And to be honest with you, we don't live and exist like that. If we have something missing, we think somebody stole it. And if we know where we left it last, let's say I take the keys that I have to a car and I hang them the same place every day for 30 years, and suddenly they're missing, even though I can look on a video camera and see, when I came home last night, I hung them up right there, and I never went back in there. There's all kinds of evidence that this is something that I can believe. Why would I believe differently? There's all kinds of things that tell us that there's a lack of randomness, that there's a lack of accidental occurring. And it's kind of fascinating to know that we already know that nothing appears as an independent fashion. We don't come across something in the middle of the wood that's been perfectly put together and just believe that somehow or another that the winds of change just blew in that direction and formulated some complex thing independently. We know better. In no other way would we ever be talking like that. It's part of the human construct. It's part of the creation construct that there has to be a creator. Okay, and that puts us back to God, who is the only uncaused cause, the only uncreated being, the only uncreated thing of any kind, and that, of course, is God. We see that creation's complex and ordered, and it's fascinating, and observation of it shown it's very predictable as well. I mean, even these kinds of pandemics are predicted. You don't believe it? Just go back to Stephen King novels back in the 80s and stuff like that. See, human pandemics have happened throughout human history. These things are predictable. There's an order and a predictability even to the creation, and it's pretty consistent. So we understand these things point to a creator. Has much of this creation expressed evidence of God? How much of it has? This much. Before Darwinism, pure atheism was nearly impossible to find. Before Darwin, pure atheism was basically impossible to find. There could have been some Eastern religions that had more of a philosophical bent that tried to analyze us as the highest power ultimately, and there's all kinds of different things that were out there from time to time. But in human history, as a rule, the answer of God has always been sought. There's always been a question of it. Now that is incredible proof for the existence of God too. We can find times and places where people didn't believe in the fairy tale. We can and a fairy tale like the Tooth Fairy or well, I'm afraid kids are listening, but anyway, some of the other fairy tales we tend to believe very, very early in life because we're taught. We can understand the origins of such things, and we also understand the limited nature of them. They don't go and are not bound across cultures for all time. The one that is this understanding, this idea, this seeking after the Creator. And we see that in the sense that there's so many millennia we can march back through written history and see the evidence of a God by the fact that people are always looking for this God, are always worshiping something. They might be trying to make God into a statue. They might be able to say that God actually lived at one time and now he's dead. I mean, there's all kinds of different things out there, but all of them are looking for God and are somehow or another worshiping something, are given spiritual answers. Now, a metaphysical world and an evolutionary theory shouldn't have spiritual elements to it. There shouldn't be any such a thing. But the fact that spiritual elements exist also, that is a great evidence to it. And so to the existence of God. So before Darwinism, we basically didn't have atheism as a tenable belief. And many places at any time, let alone in all places for long periods of time. It just didn't exist. It wasn't out there. So here's what's fascinating about this, okay? What then we have is, what is a human construct? If we can look back and march this back before Darwin and say there's practically no atheism, and now we say, wow, 80% of the European continent are agnostic or atheist. There's a great deal, a great number of people in Canada, the same thing. More and more people in the United States this way, okay? There's more people who say, I don't have a particular belief now in the United States than there are that people that say, I have a particular belief and doctrine of God. That is post-Darwinism. Before it, it's almost not there. So then what looks like the human construct? It isn't the existence of God. It's the other thing, if that makes sense. I mean, that's logical, that's rational, that's how we would measure evidence in any other discipline. So why not use the same kind of rationale here? So one of the things that we have in that as well is to think that here we are, and evolutionary theory would say this, that we are 200,000 to 300,000 years as a species. Basically Homo sapiens, or basically that's about 300,000, I think, years old. So in that process, what they are saying is, over the last 150, 200 years, we all of a sudden got everything figured out, or we basically know our origins now. And they never did before that. That's a baseless type of arrogance. We talked a few lessons ago about the fact that they've been doing advanced brain surgery since at least 800 BC. And so why would we think we would have this kind of thing figured out in this kind of way and now? And I think that that is a huge evidence, not for atheism, not for an evolutionary theory, but instead for something that pre-existed those things long ago. Now, I don't believe that humans have been around for 300,000 years old. I believe that we've been around a whole lot shorter than that, but that's not even the point what I'm trying to make. If I believed that they were 300,000 years uh, on the earth, then as humans, then why would I think that just in the last 200 you certainly got everything figured out? It doesn't make sense. Um, Another evidence we can give for the existence of God is the transcendent nature of many things. Again, this is something Dr. Moeller mentions, um, and that's this. Uh, Evolution can't explain certain transcendent things. Transcendence means something greater, something bigger, something that lasts beyond. Okay? And so if we have it like this, one of the things we see in that is love. You find the oldest stories that are recorded by man, and there's interactions and relationships between people. And the oldest stories we have transcendence of good and evil. This struggle. So in these old stories, you always have those old literary elements like man versus man and man versus the elements and what have you. Well, they're always there because there's an evil and there's a good. So those things seem to be so transcendent. Those things show up over and over and over again. Those things cannot be explained by atheism. And there's no transcendence in that worldview of anything, okay? No transcendence whatsoever. Um, in fact, in that worldview, the only thing that can exist is metaphysical. There can't be anything else. So um, this begs the question: since we have all this figured out all of a sudden, and since we now know that nothing is transcendent, do we just devolve now? Do we say, okay, well, let's go back to some things and call them transcendent, even though they're not? Um, the atheist must say there's no transcendence in love, no explanation for it, and indeed it really doesn't exist because it's not metaphysical. This begs the question, over and over again, where do they go from here then? What is virtue anyway? You know, that's a word that you might find. That's a Jeffersonian word. We find that in some of the early church or other early American forefathers, and we find that as late as Thomas Jefferson certainly really used a lot. Virtue. Benjamin Franklin later than that used virtue a lot, and so that terminology, what's it mean? If there is not, I mean, virtue's not metaphysical. Who's going to decide what's right or wrong, good or bad? How do we decide what's better than not better? How do we decide that it's better to care for the good of others or not to care for the good of others? How about this? How is it virtuous at all right now that we want to slow down or stop a pandemic if any way possible, scrambling to do so, spending money and time to do so, and rightly we should be. We scramble like this to do it because we're trying to preserve human life. In an evolutionary theory, in an atheistic worldview, what's the difference? In fact, what would we be looking for? What should we expect? In a process of natural selection, we should absolutely expect that we should not only see pandemics, but we should be glad for them to cull species so that either the species will die out or that the species will be culled down in order that it can survive with what is left, and that's the strongest. And so we don't see that happening. We see a hypocrisy. We see an existential hypocrisy among that atheistic evolutionary worldview where now all of a sudden they care It's an odd thing. And I do believe they care. And it's not because they're atheists. It's because they're made in the image and likeness of God. And no matter what we do, no matter all the sin and everything the fall caused, we cannot rid ourselves of the very way that God has built us and wired us for some of these purposes that are so strong that even with the existence of sin, those things still exist within us. We still have the image and likeness of God. It's just marred. It's not broken. It's not finished. It's not over. It's just dysfunctional somewhat, okay, because of sin. But it's not like, I had a car one time, or a truck one time, Melissa, who's watching right now, and it was an old homemade flatbed, and I used it on the farm, and I called it my old farm truck. I said it was so ugly a dog wouldn't chase it. And the thing was done long before I got it. Paid nearly nothing for it. Drove it for a couple years, worked it to pieces, never changed the oil. Finally, the transmission was shot on it. I still sold it and got half my money back, okay? So, but why did I use it? Because even though it was dysfunctional, it served a purpose. Even in the most dysfunction of our fallenness, there is a sense in which God's image and likeness are much greater than those things. And that's a very powerful thing. So no matter how terrible a person can be, it seems like there's always some part of the image and likeness of God that you can see shine through sometimes. And that's a very, very strong argument for the existence of God. And we should take that as a very serious evidence. Our transcendent quality in humanity that seems always to creep in at all times is justice. I've never seen a person, no matter how ugly, terrible person they are, they're always cry for justice. Now that's a very strong evidence for God. Just a cold and just uncaring process. Us just being somewhat sentient beings with basically just the right construct to be somewhat intelligent for now, and hopefully evolving into even more intelligent life forms, then does it make sense that people like us would cry for justice? And no matter how far we march that back in human history, we see this cry for justice over and over and over again. Laws being made, laws adjudicated, concern over fairness. That is the image and likeness of God bleeding through and as further evidence. And so that's just one more. Another of these is love for our families. This is an interesting thing. I've never met somebody who didn't love somebody. Maybe they exist. I don't know. I mean, I'm not saying it doesn't happen. I'm just saying I've never met them. And I've been a lot of places and been around, lived a few different places in my life. So I've never met them. I mean, from Appalachian bar rooms to churches in South Louisiana to suburbs of Chicago. I've been there, okay? And I know what lives out here, places much further away than that. And the one thing that I've never failed to see is that there's always, always, always love. That there's some element that we either crave or we have of that. It's interesting to know that the two most important commands are love God and love others. Our whole substance and being is built on that. It's interesting because the two greatest commands are to be rational and thinking, even though it's important and we're made like that. But they're greater than this, and it's love. And so we see this. And so here's the question that maybe we can ask people when they really want to get to be real good naturalists on us. We could say, why is it that you or I would be so willing to donate a kidney to a sick parent, even if it just bought them 5 or 10 more relatively healthy years? Why would we ever do that? Knowing it could take 5 years of life off of us because of love. Why would we donate a kidney to a child who may not live long enough to even get to adulthood? Just to have 3 or 4 more years, we would donate a kidney. What if they said, you're not even healthy enough to donate the kidney, and it's going to end your life probably about the same time? You know what? I ain't seen many parents who wouldn't say, yeah, I'm going to go ahead and donate it anyway. Why is that? It's love. That's not some cold, unfeeling thing, and it's not some construct of emotion that can't be explained. That is deep. That is in our DNA. That is in our DNA. We will never get away from that. Love is an incredible evidence of um, of the existence of God. I know I can't be very exhaustive in this short video, and without elaborating or the opportunity to explain the statement or take a lot of questions, I'm not going to be very exhaustive at all. But this is a good solid foundation for what we call theism, for the existence of God. Some of these are some of the evidences that point toward some very rational thinking about why we believe God exists, and so those are just some good starting places for us. One of the things I want to throw back to is that last one about love. This is one of the fundamental problems that I have. Like when I hear some of the statements that I hear, see some of the statements that I see posted from people who follow Christ or say they follow Christ, when they're unloving and really hateful and harsh, then it's really frustrating. It's frustrating this way. It is so frustrating that I look at it and I think, but if you hate this whole group of people, or you're willing to, like, you're really willing to dig your heels in to offend all the time, then I'm not sure that you're representing not only the love of Christ, but it's hard to use that argument when some of the most unloving people I've ever met say they follow Christ. And so that's something that we gotta work on. We're gonna have those times when we in close relationships won't feel like we're loving each other very well. And we should work on that. But certainly for the watching world, love needs to really be something that they understand emanating from us. Because it would be a bad thing to look at them and make that argument and then them say, well, if that's the case, I guess I believe in God and you don't. And that's a scary thought. So just think about that one, okay? Again, we will stop here today and we'll pick back up tomorrow, and we're going to talk tomorrow about evidence. Specifically, tomorrow we'll be talking about the evidence of a biblical worldview of humanity and reliability of the Christian scriptures, okay? And I said from the beginning, one of the best arguments for the Christian faith is the Christian scriptures and their reliability. And tomorrow we'll examine that some. And again, it'll just be laying a little bit of foundation. We won't even be able to get very far, but it'll help, I think. So y'all have a good evening. If you got youth, then I'm hoping that we will. I'll be making that Zoom call, that Zoom meeting. Have them log in not till like right at 8 p.m. Okay, that way I get on there first, and then we don't get crossed up and people get cut out of the meeting. Tammy will be on there with me as well as the youth. So we look forward to that. Love y'all, and you have a good night. Also, don't forget Miss Lucy's daughter, Beth. We want to pray for her. That was a prayer request I forgot, so I just posted it in a type form. Don't forget to pray for Beth. And so take care. We'll talk to you soon.